Hello everybody, this is the BG, and today we're going to talk about jowl bacon, or what I like to call bacon's bacon. When you fry jowl bacon, the fat just completely melts in your mouth when you eat it, and I just can't stop. I could literally eat an entire pound plate of it very quickly without even thinking about it. It is delightful. This video serves as an extension from the bacon video to show what are the differences between prepping the jowl bacon versus a belly bacon, and then how to slice it.
To get started, let's talk about the equipment and ingredients that you'll need to make jowl bacon. First, you'll need a piece of pork jowl. What we're showing you here is about 3 pounds. You'll also need a meat slicer, smoker that can allow you to cold smoke the bacon. You'll also need knives and cutting board, mixing bowl and spoon, medium and large aluminum pans, pink salt aka Prague Powder number 1, kosher salt, and dark brown sugar. A digital scale, although we found it easier to have 2 scales, one will do if you only have one. A jelly roll pan and a rack, plastic wrap, rubber gloves, some chunks of apple wood, and a vacuum sealer and vacuum sealing bags. We prefer VacMaster bags.
So like in the bacon video, we're doing the same thing as far as the cure mixture. I need to make my bacon cure mixture, which is for every 10 pounds of meat, you're going to need 14.51 grams of pink salt or Prague Powder number 1. You're going to need 102 grams of Morton's kosher salt, and then 51 grams of dark brown sugar. I prefer to get the organic dark brown sugar. After weighing all those out, you're going to mix them extremely well by hand so that you are making sure that everything is completely homogeneous as far as the mixture. The more consistent this mixture is, the better the end product is, because you have a more consistent ratio of the sodium nitrite that's in the pink salt or the Prague Powder number 1 getting into the meat. After the cure mixture is ready, the next step is actually preparing the meat. When you get a piece of jowl from the butcher, it is certainly a mutant piece of meat. It's a little bit scary the first time you look at it, but it's basically the same thing as the belly. The only thing that's different about it is the fact that the lymph nodes that happen, this is the cheek of the hog, there's lymph nodes attached to the meat. And my prep is just getting rid of all those lymph nodes. Anywhere where the meat looks speckled on the top there, I want to get rid of that. You technically can eat that, I just don't want to. To me, the lymph nodes provide a different texture layer versus that core piece of meat and the fat, and I just don't want to have that in the cut. I'm just going to be very careful with just making sure that I'm only getting the layer of fat that's against the table. There is a layer of meat, and then there's going to be another layer of fat, and then on top of that's going to be where all the lymph nodes are. You're going to just keep cutting away at this until you get to that clean layer of fat. This piece of meat has the skin taken off. I always have the skin taken off when I'm doing the belly or the jowl. But when I flip it over, I'm just going to make sure that all the skin has been taken off and that there's not any pieces still on that. So if you hold it up to the light, you'll be able to see the differences in the shine on the meat, or the fat, of the skin versus the fat layer below the skin. The one thing that I don't do anymore is actually cut this piece in half. The first step that I showed, where I took the longer piece of the jowl and I cut them in 2, I don't do that anymore. This is actually the left and the right side of the cheeks of the hog. They just take the entire kind of throat strip off of the hog when they're cutting it off. And it's much easier to leave it whole when you're hanging it, when you're smoking it. I just cut it in half on this version because the smoker that I was using, I was putting everything on shelves and it was easier to have them cut in half. So if you're doing this within a smoker, I would recommend cutting it in half. If you're going to do this with a larger smoker where you can actually hang the pieces from, I would leave it as a whole strip. Leaving it as a whole strip also makes it easier to mark the direction of the grain. Anytime that you're slicing bacon, you want to make sure that you are going against the grain when you make the slices. If you're going with the grain when you're slicing, then you're going to have a much tougher piece of meat, because the grain of the meat fiber stays intact along the entire strip of bacon. Where if you cut it against the grain, the meat fibers are very, very short, and it makes it much more tender. Jowls are a little bit trickier as far as marking the grain, because there's actually 2 layers, partial layers of meat, and they're going opposite to each other. The primary layer of meat fibers is actually going along the length of the piece of jowl. And so if you leave it as one long rectangle, it's much easier to note that. This is also a good time to discuss the differences between the fats around the different areas of the hog. With these 5 videos, between the ham hocks, the belly bacon, the jowl bacon, and then next month we'll do pea meal bacon, you're seeing very distinctive pieces of meat around the hog. The best fat on the hog to me is the jowl. It melts in your mouth, it has delicious flavor, it fries extremely well, it renders really well. So to me, this is the best cut. Belly would be the second, and then when you're talking about something like a pork chop, which would be making up the pea meal bacon, that pork chop actually has a pretty stout fat to it. It fries up and it actually holds its shape better than a lot of the other pieces of fat on the hog. But for the pea meal bacon, actually, I'm completely removing that. So the pea meal is a very, very lean cut. But comparing it to the cut that it's coming from, the back fat that makes up the pork loin is one of the stiffest pieces of fat on the hog. The ham has somewhere on the in-between on the fat. It is softer, still holds its shape a little bit, tastes great, but to me is the in-between piece. The last thing, which we're not actually doing here, is the leaf lard. The leaf lard is the fat that comes from the inside of the rib cage, and that's what your grandmother would have used for actually making a pie. It comes out of the inside of the rib cage as like this long, thin lump, and you cut it up and render it down very carefully, and then strain it. It is a delicious, flavorless fat that you can use for baking. After we have all the pieces ready, and then the cure mixture is already done, we can start doing the shake and bake method like we've shown on the ham videos and on the bacon video. What I am doing here is I'm taking however many pieces of meat I want to put in a vacuum bag, weighing them, and then multiplying the pounds of meat by 16.76 grams to figure out how many grams of cure mixture I need for the total poundage of meat. So in this case, I have 2.84 pounds of the jowl. I'm going to multiply that by 16.76, which gets me to 47.6 grams. I'm going to go 1 to 2 grams over that just to hedge my bets against if anything comes out of the bag when I'm shaking it or pouring it into the bag. It just gives me a little bit of leeway. With that, I'm going to make sure that I have my vacuum sealed bag prepared, the bottom sealed on it. I'll put the meat in the bag. I'll pour the cure mixture into the bag, shake and bake it, make sure that it's distributed well in the bag, and then vacuum seal it. If you watched this whole series where we talk about how to make ham and to make bacon, I discuss why I'm actually vacuum sealing it here. To me, I think it's a very important step as far as the consistency of the product and then making sure that the diffusion of this salt mixture is getting all the way through the meat. Once the packages are fully sealed, you're going to be putting them into the fridge for a week, for 7 days. I do a midweek check just to make sure that the cure is getting around the meat mixture. You'll just want to take the packages out of the fridge, massage them a little bit, make sure that the brown sugar and the salt are dissolving and that they're getting throughout the bag. This step is not needed when you're doing ham because there's enough meat juice in it that it distributes itself, but since bacon and jowl bacon have a higher fat content, it makes it slightly more difficult for this mixture to actually diffuse over the meat. After 7 days have finished, you're going to take the meat out of the fridge, open up the bags, put them in your sink, fill it up, rinse them off really well, pat them dry, and then I prefer to let them sit in the fridge overnight. You can technically go right into cold smoking if you want to, but you get a little bit better product if you were to let that meat actually just sit in the fridge, uncovered, just on a rack for a day. If this was a hot smoking process, then letting the meat sit for a day is even more important because it forms something called the pellicle. The sugar that's in the recipe will form a stickier surface on the meat, and that makes it easier for the smoke to stick to it. Since this is a cold smoking process, it's not needed as much because I'm not worried about getting, any smoke to stick on the outside of the meat. I'm worried about smoke actually permeating through the meat. For this, I'm going to be doing 6 rounds of smoking, all about 50 minutes long at about 180 degrees on the bottom of the chamber. What you see in the video is I have an insulating plate that sits over top of the smoke box, and then I have a basket of ice that sits on top of that. The goal is to keep the upper chamber where the meat is below 100 degrees. There is a much longer discussion of this if you want to watch the bacon video. And so for this, I'm just really following the same process as that video. I need to make sure that I'm keeping the upper chamber below 100 degrees, preferably under 80 degrees. This is the perfect situation for botulism to occur, which is why I spent a lot of time when we did the bacon video discussing making sure that this meat is cured properly, handled properly, and then smoked properly. If any of these things are not done correctly, you have a risky case here for botulism. So for this in total, what I'm doing is every 50 minutes, I'm going to smoke this meat. I actually leave the door open when I'm using this type of smoker to get the internal temperature to cool down as much as possible. And then I'll put in another chunk of applewood and then smoke it for another 50 minutes at 180 degrees in the lower chamber. What I'm doing is I'm keeping an eye on the upper chamber to make sure that it's below 80 degrees is my preferable range. Like what we talked about in the bacon video, anything under 100 degrees is considered cold smoking. Anything above 100 degrees is considered hot smoking. This whole process requires that it needs to be cold smoked. After the meat is fully smoked and you'll actually see that rich amber color occur on the outside of it, the next step is to prepare it for slicing. If you tried to slice this at refrigerator temperature, it would go horrible. You need to have it where it is partially frozen. Easiest way to do that is to wrap each piece of meat in some saran wrap and then put it in the freezer for, I can't give an exact time because everybody's freezer is a little bit different, but it's going to take probably 2 to 3 hours plus for it to happen. Just keep checking on it, see how rigid it is. You're looking for it where it's almost able to bend. If you're uncertain of how rigid it should be from the freezer, the easiest thing is just simply start slicing it, because if it's too frozen, it just won't slice. The slicer won't be able to go through it. And if it's too warm, then you're going to get really ragged edges on the meat. There's a sweet spot where it's just frozen, where it slices really cleanly and very easily. Like we talked about earlier, the main point here is to make sure that the meat fibers are going in the right direction. I need to make sure that I'm going against the grain. I knew that when I cut this, that the shorter side of that rectangle is the cross section of the meat, so I'm going to make sure that that's against the blade. That way the longer piece of the rectangle is going up, and then when I'm slicing it, you can actually verify when you pull a piece of meat out that if you're going with the grain, you'll see long strands. If you're going against the grain, you'll see a bunch of spots because you're seeing all the cross sections of the meat fibers. The final step is packaging the bacon, and we prefer to freeze it. If you don't want to freeze it, this will be good for about 2 weeks in the refrigerator. But if you're going to freeze it, we package it in either half-pound or 1-pound packages. In this case, I'm doing half-pound packages. But I'm just going to weigh out a half-pound, get a vacuum seal bag ready, and then put the meat in, get it vacuum sealed. The big thing you have to worry about is that since this is a fatty, sticky piece of meat, you need to make sure that you have air gaps around the bag when you're sealing it, because it's easy for the meat to close off an air pathway and then not getting the bag completely sealed down. So there you go. That's how you make jowl bacon. It's delicious. I don't know why the hipster crowd hasn't adopted it. The only time that I actually see jowl bacon at a butcher is usually at an old school butcher. To me, it's better than bacon. It should be used more often than bacon, and actually buying the raw meat is cheaper than buying belly. One of the best dishes to showcase it would actually be using it for pasta carbonara. The Italians use the jowl, cured a little bit differently than this case, but that's what they're using meat-wise for pasta carbonara. So if you want to be even more particular about making it the best way possible, go ahead and make up some jowl bacon for yourself. But this is the BG, keeping it square.
Thanks for watching today, and welcome to all our new subscribers. Who knew that so many people were interested in how to clean sausage casing? I guess you did. I have been so loving your comments about sausage making, so keep them coming. We'll keep responding. In our next episode, we'll close out this series on bacon and ham by showing you how to make pea meal bacon. Subscribe to us and check out our website where you can sign up for our newsletter and find out what's on our production schedule for next year. Thanks for joining us on our final freezer.
I love jowl bacon.
What does jowl bacon taste like?
Butter.
Butter?
Tastes like pancake.
What is jowl bacon?
I think there's someone named Jowl, and he's eating bacon.
Oh, okay.